Welcome everyone to the breakout session, the first breakout session. For those of you who don't know, I'm Clifton Sanders, Provost for Academic Affairs here at SLCC. And what we want to do is, after a stimulating and excellent keynote speech for this session, we want to bring back Dr. Gina and Garcia, and she will expand on her morning keynote speech to explore how Hispanic serving institutions can benefit students of all identities and share best practices for undertaking the work. Now, the format is Dr. Garcia will present, and there will be time, we hope, for Q&A. We have for the in-person, we have microphones on either side of the main rows of the Grand Theater. We also have someone who will be monitoring the chats online for those of you who are streaming. And so I think with that, let's get started and welcome Dr. Gina and Garcia back.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. Hopefully I will be able to see it. Let me see. Let me see. Okay. So you'll need a phone or a laptop. I don't know if y'all have. I thought everybody was going to be in Zoom, so I was assuming y'all will all be at your computers, but I'm going to have y'all answer a series of questions. So let me make sure it's activated. Okay. All right, go ahead and see if you can answer it either by texting or you can go to this website here. All right, so it looks like I got mostly a good number of mix of faculty and the professional staff, student support staff, some administrators. It's just helped me as we have this conversation to know who's in the room. And I assume you all were in the talk that I just gave an hour ago. So you'll know my perception of like, that becoming an HSI is like based on where you're at in the institution. So everybody, no matter what your role is, as we go through this, I want you to think, what is my role and how am I going to enact serving this? So the next one should be, what academic outcomes? This is going to help us to talk about the typology. All right, the typology that I'm going to have y'all think through together about where your location is. I was really hoping I could talk to y'all. So this is a little bit awkward. I'm trying to like rethink this. I don't know if y'all can talk to each other, but if you can, and you're all at a table together, if y'all want to go ahead and have a conversation about this question, because you might not know, but that's okay. Like you don't have to have solid data, but if y'all want to just go ahead and have a conversation, I'm assuming y'all are together. What are the academic outcomes that are most relevant to equity conversations? So when y'all are talking about equity and when you're thinking about those outcomes, those important student outcomes, which ones of these are most important? Because I don't want to project and say that you all should be striving for certain outcomes if those aren't the ones that are most relevant to you. So I'm going to pause and allow y'all, assuming that y'all are together. I don't know, maybe somebody can chat me and let me know if y'all are together in a room, that if you can have small group conversations and then start to respond to this.
Hi, Dr. Garcia. This is Clifton Sanders. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I just wanted to let you know we are in a theater here, and so it's kind of theater seating, but there might be opportunity for people to have some small group conversations, but the space is not very flexible that way.
Yeah. That's my fault. I don't know why I thought this was actually meeting, small group breakout meeting. So we'll do our best. It's supposed to be interactive. So that's the only problem. So if you have at least a neighbor you can talk to about this, go ahead and have a conversation with your neighbor to get the conversation going around the typology, that like the outcomes that I talked about. What are those outcomes?
Okay, I'm speaking to those who are virtual. There are breakout rooms for you to, oh, hold on. We're not able to do breakout rooms, unfortunately.
Right, but like, is there somebody you can talk to like next to each other? Like people next to each other can have a conversation? And I should, so that like, just so that there is some conversation around like the outcomes. And I don't know if people can answer this question, but I just went ahead and launched it. So go ahead and fill out this one, and then we'll talk about it. I just want to know more specifically, like if you're thinking about the outcomes in that typology, which ones are important? Okay, cool. I see people go ahead and answer. So go ahead. If you have a conversation with someone next to you, cool. If not, just go ahead and answer it. Okay, cool. So go ahead and keep answering the question. So going back to that typology that I talked about, the outcomes and what are the important outcomes as you think about serving this. So there's a bunch, and this is why I wanted to do, and I'm glad I did the polls that we can do this no matter what setting we're in. So as you're thinking about these different outcomes, these all should become part of the servingness. So the measures of servingness, if you go to the literature on HSI, there's very limited conversations about job and economic outcomes. So that's why I was like, I really wanted to make, because usually in a community college, that's an important outcome. So the fact that that's actually coming up as pretty high, and then, as one of the ones that's pretty high on the outcomes, that should be a part of the servingness conversation. But if you went to the HSI research, it's not. Like, it's not a common conversation to talk about jobs and economic outcomes as an indicator of serving. And so part of my research right now is challenging that, to say, like, what are the different things that would indicate serving? So as you start to have conversations on your campus about, are we doing these things equitably? Because you want to also have the equity conversation. It's equitably for your Latino students, equitably for your students of color, and then which of these things, right? So maybe your 150% graduation rates, maybe there's inequities there, right? Like you start to disaggregate, maybe there's inequities. You're like, students aren't really getting the AA, maybe more white students than Latino students, or maybe more students that aren't Pell eligible than Pell eligible students, because you should disaggregate by that as well. And then maybe that looks different for your transfer rates, right? If you start to disaggregate your transfer rates, which those are important too, maybe there's different sort of inequities popping up in there. And then the economic job outcomes, I'm actually really excited that I asked these questions, because that's the highest one right now, right? It's coming up with 16 of y'all saying that's an important outcome. We should start to assess that, right? Like if you're going to assess serving, like people ask me to help them to assess servingness all the time. And I'm like, okay, here's some general ways you can. We don't generally assess servingness in an HSI on the number of students who get jobs. It's an important thing, but for some reason in higher ed, we spend so much time thinking about transferring and graduating and completing that we don't really think about what's next, yet what's next actually is an important outcome, right? So I want that to be part of the conversation. Now that we see that it's an important part of what y'all do, and going back to that idea that you're going to be the kind of HSI that you're going to be, right? That like, what do you do well? What do we want to do well? If you want to produce equitable economic outcomes for students and job outcomes for students, then you're going to have to start measuring that, right? How are you going to know if you're fulfilling those outcomes? Because it's going to make a difference on where you're going in that typology, right? Like, because if you're saying, well, we're not doing a good job of producing this one outcome that we're really committed to, which is job and economics, then we're probably lower on the scale in those boxes, right? In the typology. So we're down low in that left side. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to ask y'all to place yourselves into the typology soon. So the next one is, in your opinion, and I want to be very clear, this is opinion, so you don't have to have strong data. But generally, as people in our organizations, we know, right? We have opinions. I have a lot of opinions about my college, my university. So in your opinion, do you think that the educational outcomes at your institution are equitable across all racial, ethnic groups, right? So if you say Salt Lake City College, we are doing a good job and we're equitably not only graduating students, not only transferring, but they're actually getting jobs. Because remember, that's the outcome you said that was important. So is there equity there? And I see strong no's. The no's are fighting with the yeses. And I'm not sure. So a lot of I'm not sure. And that's okay. You can totally be in the I'm not sure space. So you can, yeah, it's pretty powerful. And also, no, I expected it to be strongly on no, because often we are struggling with outcomes. That's the reality. Many institutions are struggling with outcomes. And until we have 100% on the outcomes, I think we all, as educators in colleges and universities, generally feel like we're not doing a good job, right? We're like, but we want, it should be more. We should be doing better. So it makes sense that people are like, we're not where we should be yet. And particularly when it's an equity conversation. And so I'm hoping y'all are voting in your opinion based on, well, maybe we do well with some students, like we might do well with like our students who aren't first gen, or our students who aren't low income, or our students who are white. Maybe they're doing better, but we're not doing as well with our minoritized populations. And that's okay, right? This is where the servingness conversation will go based on what we talk about here as y'all start to have your conversations. Because I always assume that after I leave a campus, even when it's only virtual, that the conversations are just about to start, that I just launch the conversation. I'm just helping to get the conversation going, although I know y'all are having these conversations anyways, but I'm just getting the conversations going. So now we can start to have these critical conversations together. All right, let's see what the next one. So this is going to get more at what we were just talking about is the outcomes, which was the y-axis on my typology. We're going to get at the organization structure, the structures. In the original article, it was called culture, but we're going to call it structures here because I've started to call it structures a lot more. So let me activate this poll. And so the question is, what curricula or programs are you using at the campus or that currently are what I call centering students of color? So I have in here ethnic studies, trio programs, going back to that, the keynote where I talked about whiteness being so dominant in higher ed. So there are spaces often on campus where we have disrupted that and said, this space is actually very much centering on students of color. It didn't activate, huh? There we go. Try again. Now, this is a open question. So you can write whatever you want because I don't know your campus. So I want you to write. You might not have ethnic studies. You might not have trio. I just put those as examples, but to get you to start thinking about where are those spaces that we would call those counter spaces, right? Where we are serving not only students of color, but also low income students. Because remember, low income is part of the identity of an HSI. So where are those curricula and programs that are centering students' ways of knowing or being? Trio, obviously you have a trio, so it's a good example. Trio is usually a space where people see a lot of that. JEDI, Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. Okay, those are usually the common spaces. ODMA, what is ODMA? Y'all gonna have to write that out for me. I would obviously ask, Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. Okay, got it. OMDA. ODMA. I see both. But I guess that's what it means. So trio, educational, ethnic studies. Okay. New in the past year. Ethnic studies is starting to come on in a lot of places. So that makes sense. Student writing and reading center. Ooh, that'd be one I would ask more. Like, tell me more. How are you centering students of colors, ways of knowing, and low-income students in that? I think that's a really important space to be doing that. I'd love to hear more. Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. Okay, so what's coming up, the ESL department, okay, what's coming up is what typically comes up, which is 1 or 2 or 3 spaces, right? It's employee of color coalition. I love that. I love that y'all have an employees of color coalition. The reality is servingness for students is important, but faculty and staff also need to be served in many ways. So I love that there are spaces for students, faculty and staff. Clubs, yes, clubs often are spaces where students find their identities. So clubs are important. The question then becomes, are you supporting clubs? How are you supporting clubs? What are you doing economically to support clubs? Because they do need the support as well. And I say economically because, definitely supporting student organizations in economic ways is important. I am working with a community college and they have a mecha, which is generally, Latino students are attracted to mecha, but they're in Anapeasy and they have a large Asian American Pacific Islander population. And they said, we don't have any good, strong club organization for that group of students, right? And they're a large population. They're like 44%. It's a pretty large population of AAPI students. And they're like, we don't have a good club, right? So that's something to think about, right? So when you start saying things like clubs, then start thinking which organizations and student organizations do you have? Even thinking about TRIO, if you start to break out TRIO, which organization or which students are going into TRIO, which students are using TRIO? I worked with a group, was that yesterday? Yesterday I was talking about the fact that spaces, we often say they're inclusionary or they're inclusive. We're like, our space is inclusive. Everybody's welcome to TRIO. Everybody's welcome to the Office of Multicultural and Diversity Affairs. I challenge y'all to think in a different way, an opposite way, which will give you a different answer, which is just the opposite, to say who is excluded. And it doesn't have to be intentionally. We often don't exclude people intentionally, but who doesn't use the space? And I'll stop and y'all don't have to answer that on here. But as you're starting to think about these areas, I want you to think, how are we adequately serving our students and which students are we not serving in some of these spaces, even though they're good spaces for, our students of color, our Latino students are likely to go there. Which students are we not serving? Because when you think about it in an exclusion versus who do we include, because people typically say, oh, we include everybody. Nobody's exclusionary outright, but people are exclusionary by the nature of exclusion, right? That unless you're intentionally naming groups, you're often excluding groups. So that would be another way to think about it, is think who isn't using the space. Service learning would be another one. Whoever said that and whoever, I assume that's your area, that's great. I want you to start disaggregating your data and thinking who doesn't use it, right? Are our Latino students using service learning? And if not, how are we going to get them to use it more? Right? Which clubs and organizations don't we have? Who's using TRIO programs? And you could even start to get some of those like different dimensions of intersectionality that I mentioned in the early slides when I gave the keynote about the intersections that we don't even know a lot about. Like, let's say queer students, gay students. Where are your gay and lesbian and queer and transgender students? Where are they finding affirmations? Is it a part of HSI? Technically not. It's not, in the name Hispanic serving, but as I encourage y'all to think about Hispanic serving as the H being intersectional, some of your Hispanic students are going to also fit into other categories like queer or like transgender or gender non-binary or students with disabilities. I have a doctoral student who is doing a dissertation right now, finishing her dissertation. It's a beautifully written dissertation. I've learned so much from it. And it's about students who are Latino and have disabilities at an HSI. And in her research, she found that students have to sort of split themselves, that if they want to get support around their disability, they have to go to one place. They want to get support around their Latino identity, they have to go to another. So how do we stop asking students to do that? How do we start to make all of our spaces a little more inclusive of more of their identities that they have, so they don't have to be going to these different spaces? Because that's hard. That's hard on students. And sometimes they never find that other space. They only find the one that they're in. So I have a lot. I could talk about this all day, right? And if we were together and having a conversation, I would want to hear some feedback from y'all, get y'all really grappling with that, but I'm going to leave y'all with that task. I'm leaving y'all with a bunch of tasks today to take it back to your spaces and say, who are we excluding? Are we thinking about our students intersectionally? Are we thinking about the intersections of Hispanic? What is it? Hispanic and low income, Hispanic and immigrant, Hispanic and Spanish speaking, Hispanic and queer, right? Like, what is it? Hispanic and, because your students are Hispanic and, right? There are multiple things. They might be Hispanic and Black. They might be Hispanic and Asian. They might be Hispanic and white. They might be Hispanic in a lot of things. So many important questions for us to ask when we're thinking about how inclusive are our spaces and or how exclusionary are our spaces. All right, this gets into the like microaggressions. I didn't get into this because I ran out of time. That was like the last few slides I had, but in the research that's coming out right now about HSIs, it's pretty strong that people are reporting at HSIs that they still are experiencing racism or microaggressions. There's been at least 5 articles that have come out in the last 2 years about that particular idea. And it's students and staff and faculty, like faculty, women, there's 2 papers I know of that like a group of women faculty at an HSI wrote that they experience microaggressions and harassment at their HSI. So I'm going to activate this one. This one can get contentious, but have you witnessed or heard, right? It could be secondhand. Maybe a student told you, you didn't have to witness it, but if they told you, then that is important too, right? That they, for one, they trusted you enough to tell you, and that we need to do something about that. This fits into the bottom category of the typology. So the outcomes was on the left, the y-axis. The x-axis has to do with culture and climate and racism and microaggressions. That's what this is right here, is like getting at the climate. If these things are happening, then we can't say yet we're an HSI, right? It's hard to say we're an HSI when we're like, yeah, except that there's anti-Blackness and there's tensions between Black and brown communities. There's tension between white people and Latinos, like whatever it may be, right? Like if there's tensions and we can't fully say we've arrived to that HSI. And that's what I found with the second institution, as I talked about. No, that was the first institution. They were talking a lot about how there was tensions between groups and a lot of racism, a lot of microaggressions. And so it's hard for me to put them, I mean, I still put them in the Latinx enhancing, but if I really started to disaggregate some of these different experiences that would lead to that like higher level of like centering students' identities and having validating experiences, that would have brought them down a little bit, because they need to deal with this, right? This is tensions they need to deal with. And until they can deal with it, then I would say you're not going to reach that full HSI status yet. So I'm going to stop sharing real quick. This has been helpful. This actually worked out. Okay, I'm glad it worked out. I was like, oh, wait, I didn't plan adequately, but I did, because I could still do this without hearing from y'all. But I'm going to go ahead and quickly share the typology, because the last question is going to have you put yourselves in the typology. So reminding you, I'm making the assumption that you were all at the talk, but if you weren't, I've been kind of reminding you of different things I talked about. But I do want to show you the typology one more time. And based on what we just talked about, I'm going to have you decide where you would put SLCC as an organization. Where are you going to put Salt Lake City College as where you're at right now, right? Like with becoming an HSI, because if you don't know where you're at, how do you know where you're going, right? Like you got to decide where you're at, and then you can go decide where we want to go as an HSI. So the student outcomes is here on the left. This was that first couple polls that we talked about, the inequities, the job, reminding you and reminding me that, jobs, getting economic outcomes is important. Graduating students, transferring students, all important. Are we doing that equitably? If we are, it would put you up into producing or serving. The bottom axis is what we were just talking about in the last few slides, the spaces where students see themselves in the curriculum and the programming, is how exclusionary and or exclusionary is it, the racism, the microaggressions, that comes out in this cultural part. Now, if you say, well, if you voted no on equitable outcomes, you would be down in the bottom. If you voted yes to racism, microaggressions, you might consider yourself more on that enrolling side. If you're saying, you know what, I think we're still doing a pretty good job. We have some pretty good spaces. We're doing good. We have the multicultural center. We have TRIO. I'm going to put us in Latinx enhancing side or up in serving side if I think we're doing it equitably. So everybody's allowed to vote how they want. All right. But the first part of this exercise was really just to get you to thinking about the data points that you would need to really adequately place you into the typology. Because those are the data points that I have people think about and work through as they're trying to place themselves into the typology. And if we were together, I'd have us go to corners. So we'll pretend we're in 4 corners of the room. You can go to different corners of the room, but I'm just going to have y'all vote. All right. So enrolling's down at the bottom, producing's up at the top, serving's up to the right, and enhancing is down at the bottom. I'm going to give you a couple more seconds to look at this before I have you vote, because usually people need to take it in, right? It's a lot to take in, to take all this in. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. It's time to vote. Dun, 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 on where you are. It's not really a dun, dun, dun. This is like an assessment. It's a self-assessment. And then you can go and start thinking about how you're going to move into the next spot based on where you vote. So let me go ahead and share it. The last one that I wanted us to get to today. Okay, so it's activated. So Latinx enrolling, Latinx producing, Latinx enhancing, Latinx serving, or I'm not sure. I'm not sure is totally a good answer. All right, so it's looking like Latinx enhancing is where a lot of folks are putting out, but not everybody. Some are saying, nope, we're just Hispanic enrolling at this point. And that there's usually a good number of people that say we got a lot of work to do. And that's okay to say we got a lot of work to do. But that's great to know that a lot of y'all, a good number of y'all, think that you're doing a pretty good job of even creating structurally some spaces for students, and you're doing a good job, and hopefully we'll continue to think through those. Some of y'all think you're doing a pretty good job equitably. And some of y'all, 8 of y'all are pretty confident that you've already hit that Latinx serving point. And so that's confident and that's good, right? It's not a bad thing to have these different varying viewpoints. These are the conversations that need to happen though. This is like, I'm with y'all for like the 30-minute talk. I talked as fast as I could, but I could not say all the things in 30 minutes. There's so many things to deal with. And this 45 minutes also, so many things to deal with. And these need to be conversations. Like I don't get to decide as an external person to the organization, as an external researcher. I don't get to be the one that decides where you are as an organization. All I do is give you ideas and ways to think about it. And so as you move forward into these conversations about HSI, I want y'all to remember some of these things, right? To think like, okay, what did she say? What did Dr. Garcia say about how we're going to know we're an HSI, right? Okay, structurally. All right, we've got to talk about outcomes. Let's get some data. Let's start to have some data so we can make more data-informed decisions. Let's document all the spaces in which we're thinking where, our Latinos students are being served. Let's talk about those different dimensions that she, that she brought to us, because that's what this really is to get y'all to start thinking as you move forward, how you're going to move forward, and what are the conversations that need to be had. I'm going to stop sharing. And with our last few minutes, I know that y'all are together and there's like a microphone or whatnot. So I want to allow, like, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I'm not hearing from anybody. So I want to allow, if anybody has questions for me, because I've talked a lot. I just talked for 40 minutes. I talked for 30 minutes earlier, to feel free to come up to the space, wherever it is in the room, and ask me a question.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. This has just been outstanding, and we truly appreciate it. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A for people in the theater. There are microphones on each side of the main aisles, and then we also have questions from online that are being monitored. And so, please, let's take this time to ask questions.
Hi, Dr. Garcia. My name is Shannon. You mentioned earlier about some institutions having bilingual centers, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like. I'm assuming some courses are taught bilingually, services provided, but what other insights might you have?
Yeah, the big bilingual conversation is coming up a lot in HSIs. The organization that I talked about, the institution, they actually were a bilingual institution by founding, right? Like by their mission. So they kind of had it sprinkled everywhere, but most institutions don't, and they're just sort of trying to get into various spaces. The University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, something. They have a long name. There are multiple institutions emerged. That's an institution that I know they've been doing some pretty good work. If you want to look to models, they have a whole bicultural, bilingual, something, B3. So 3 different ways in which they're thinking about it. That center is working with faculty in particular to how to get bilingualism into the classroom. So there is a focus for sure on bilingualism in the classroom. There's a couple books, edited books that have been written. One's called Bordered Identities, and it's about Latino students at HSIs. And it's written by composition faculty who wrote about what it looks like to get bilingualism into their composition courses. And so I think right now where we're at is there are faculty that are individually trying to do it. There aren't a lot of good models other than UTRGV. I guess it is just UTRGV, that they have more of an institutional model, or this institution that I worked with in Chicago. They're called St. Augustine College. And I share their name because they're pretty open with, like, I used a pseudonym in the book, but they're pretty open with me sharing what they do. That they have more of an institutional level, but most places are trying to figure it out like one by one. Dominican University, I know in Chicago, they are a Catholic institution. They have created a program where they're working with staff and faculty who want to be better speakers, also Spanish speakers. Maybe they're learning Spanish or they're trying to get better skills at speaking Spanish. So they're offering training even on campus for their faculty and staff. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. It's like, how are you going to put it into your curriculum with your students, and or how are you going to get your own faculty and staff up competencies, right? Because we know speaking multiple languages is we want to value that with our students, but we want to be able to interact with them as well. So how do we value that? The other thing I would say about that, though, is that some folks who I've talked to that are bilingual speakers also feel like they should be compensated for that. And that's valid, right? Like, they're like, okay, we speak Spanish, we go out and give these presentations in Spanish, we're representing the university, but we don't get paid anything extra for it. It's a skill, right? It's a skill to be able to speak multiple languages, and then also to be able to speak it in ways that are like translating the things that the university wants the person to translate, like financial aid. That's hard, right? That's hard to be able to do that. So that's something else I would challenge y'all to think about. It's like, how are we going to compensate people who are doing this bilingual work? Because it's extra work, and we often don't compensate people for doing extra time. So some things, there's a lot of evolving, emerging models, but there's not one solidly good model, I don't think, for HSIs yet.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. This is a question that's anonymous from the chat. It says, how do you push back against the zero-sum gain mentality when you intentionally design programs and services for Latinx students?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that the reality is it's complicated, right? Like you have to be real with that it's complicated. So there's a couple different things. One is if you're an HSI and you're getting HSI dollars, that you can center your Hispanic population because it's HSI dollars. And so that's what it's for, right? So there's that. Now, the other thing I would encourage you to do is start to hit the intersections, right? Now, the intersections will open it up more so it doesn't feel like a zero sums game, right? Where you're saying, well, we're thinking about Hispanic students, low income students, first gen students. Those are the most common descriptors that people use to describe students at HSIs. That right there, probably most of your students can fit into one of those. Almost all students can say they're one of those at an HSI. If not Hispanic, potentially low income and potentially first gen. So I think that there's that, right? Is like we have to be intentional and like not say we're doing all lives matter type stuff because that matters too, that we don't want to just say we're going to broadly just provide services and hope that the right people get it, because you need to center the right people who you want to serve. Equity, if you're not naming the groups you're working for, you're not going to do good equity work because you're just hoping that it hits the people that need it. And chances are it's not. Chances are it's going to hit the people who already don't need it and who are already getting served. So you do need to name the groups that you want to be intentionally serving. But to get at that more broad perspective, think about what are the intersections, right? And what are the students on our campus that are needing the most support? Often it's low income students. Low income students often have inequitable outcomes. Low income is part of the HSI identity. So it could be part of the work that you're doing. So I think you just need to be a little bit more intentional about like, what are the groups that are being served by HSI and how does it broadly serve multiple minoritized groups? So it won't become an all lives matter thing if you say we're looking at minoritized groups, the groups that need the equity work the most. And if it's low income students, then it's low income students. And yes, serve your low income students because they need it and they often are having inequitable outcomes. So, but at the same time, it's complicated and that's okay. And I think you need to have these critical conversations to know that sometimes people need spaces. We need to be like valid. It's valid to know that people of color need to have counter spaces. Professionals of color need their associations, and that's okay too. That we have to be okay with having spaces, particularly for some groups, and know that there's going to be other spaces where it's a little bit more broad.
Well, thank you, Dr. Garcia. We are at the end of our first workshop time, and so the next session is at 2:00, and we want to stay on task. So please, I hope that this conversation continues. And so let's go ahead and move to the next sessions. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.